Noam's going to speak for about 50 minutes, and then while he's speaking, there'll be some ushers coming through with note cards. You can write down a question, send it up to the front, and at the end, depending on how much time we have, I'll share some of those questions with him, and he'll respond to some of those audience questions. I'm not going to say a lot about Noam. There's a reason why there are 1,800 people here tonight to see him speak. This is a very interesting moment. We're on the eve of the 50th anniversary of his seminal essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, published in this coming February. Will be the 50th anniversary of that. And he's gone on to write so many important works. Just last week, I got an email from someone who was asking for a bibliography of Noam's political writings, and I referred him to the website chomsky.info, and there's a section there where it lists some of Noam's books, and he wrote back, he said, I saw that, but I didn't think that one person could have possibly written all those books, so I thought it was a mistake. But indeed, he has written all those books and contributed in so many other ways, and truly is someone who embodies, more than any other person alive, I think, the meaning of solidarity, which is something that we really desperately need in these times today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thank you very much. Humans have been on the earth for about 200,000 years, and the generation that's coming of age today is in a position that's unique. Whether uniquely privileged or uniquely unlucky has yet to be determined. But that it's unique is very clear. For the first time in human history, it's necessary to make a crucial decision. Will organized human life continue to exist on this earth, or will it not? And that's not in the indefinite future. It's a near future. The significance of this question cannot be overemphasized. There are two imminent threats to decent human survival, and there are others that are lurking not too far behind. One of these threats can be very easily dated, August 6th, 1945. That's the date on which we learned that human intelligence had devised the means to destroy ourselves. It was never seriously in doubt that the capacity to destroy would escalate and that it would diffuse to many hands, sharply raising the threat of self-annihilation. In the years that followed, the record of near misses is appalling, sometimes from accident and error, a few shocking cases from recklessness, if not worse. And today the threat is growing in both categories. Escape from catastrophe for 70 years is a near miracle, and such miracles cannot be trusted to perpetuate. On that fateful day in 1945, which personally I remember very well, humanity entered into a new era, the nuclear age, an era that is unlikely to last very long. Either we will soon bring it to an end, or it is likely to bring us to an end. I'm not going to take the time to run through the record here, but it is indeed appalling, and new information is constantly being unearthed. Actually, one of the most serious incidents was in 1983. It turns out to have been a very close call and very relevant to current concerns. We have just very recently learned more about it, thanks to many years of efforts by the National Security Archive to obtain access to classified documents. Recently succeeded. The new revelations have to do with the nuclear command exercise called Able Archer in 1983. In an effort to probe Russian defenses, the Reagan administration launched operations simulating an attack on Russia, leading right up to a pretend nuclear attack, a simulated launch of nuclear weapons. This happened to be at a moment of extreme international tension. Pershing 2 missiles with flight time of a few minutes to Moscow had just been emplaced in Western Europe, and there were other threat escalations. A few years ago, when Russian archives were declassified, it was learned, not too surprisingly, that the Russians had taken this pretty seriously. There has been uncertainty, however, about what was understood in Washington, and the new evidence that's just been released reveals that Washington recognized right away that Able Archer, I'm now quoting, may have inadvertently placed our relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger. That was the judgment of a presidential advisory board at the time, meaning that Washington recognized that we were at the verge of terminal nuclear war. Furthermore, we have now learned U.S. intelligence determined that the Russians were mobilizing forces, quoting again, to an unusual level of alert, which according to protocol means that the U.S. should have reacted in kind, leading to disaster. Turns out that one Air Force officer, a man named Leonard Perutz, decided on his own not to follow prescribed procedures, but to do nothing, perhaps averting terminal war. We already knew that shortly after this, Russian automated systems detected a U.S. nuclear attack, and the officer in charge, Stanislav Petrov, also decided to do nothing instead of transmitting the information to a higher level, possibly triggering a massive nuclear strike. And any nuclear strike means termination. The record reveals many such frightening episodes, not to speak of shocking recklessness and adventurism, which, to make it worse, is often applauded in sober commentary. I'll return soon to the current growing threat. The second imminent threat is global warming, and the same date, the end of World War II, is again of critical significance. For some time, as you probably know, the geologists have recognized that the Earth is entering into a new geological era called the Anthropocene, an era that's defined by extreme human impact on the environment. There has been disagreement about just what changes became so extreme as to signal the onset of this new era. And a few months ago, the official working group on the Anthropocene recommended to the International Geological Congress that the dawn of the Anthropocene should be given the same date, the end of World War II. So according to their analysis, the Anthropocene and the nuclear age coincide, posing a dual threat to the survival of organized human life. The report of the Working Group on the Anthropocene discusses the sharp acceleration of extinction rates of animals and plants. And they warn that the Earth is on course to see 75% of species become extinct in the next few centuries if current trends continue. And they also confirm the conclusion of other scientists that climate warming CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere at the fastest rate for 66 million years, and furthermore that fossil fuel use is pushing levels from 280 particles of CO2 per million, it's called ppm, before the Industrial Revolution, to over 400 ppm last July, new record, and it's rising at a rate unprecedented in the geological record. 400 ppm is a significant number that comes perilously close to the estimated level of stability of the huge Antarctic ice sheet, which is estimated about 450 ppm. And it's understood that the collapse of the ice sheet would have catastrophic consequences for sea level rise. These are processes already underway, pretty ominously, in the Arctic regions. And the broader picture is no less ominous. Practically every month breaks new temperature records. Huge droughts are threatening survival for hundreds of millions of people. There are also factors in some of the most horrendous conflicts, Syria today, Darfur not long ago. Again, I won't take time to review the record, but it should be deeply alarming to anyone with eyes open. It's widely recognized that we have entered the period of the sixth mass extinction. The fifth extinction, 66 million years ago, is attributed to a huge asteroid that hit the Earth, destroying 75% of the species on Earth, ending the age of the dinosaurs, opening the way for the rise of small mammals, ultimately humans, about 200,000 years ago. And it's taken us only a few hundred years to bring about the sixth extinction, which is interestingly different from the earlier ones. So recent studies show in quite instructive ways. In the earlier mass extinctions, body size was not correlated with extinction. But in the human-generated sixth extinction, which is now underway, researchers report, I'm now quoting, an extreme bias against large-bodied animals that distinguishes the modern diversity crisis from all deep-time analogs, which means, in short, that we're mainly killing larger animals. And that's a record that goes back to proto-humans a million years ago. From the beginning, a predatory species that caused significant harm to large organisms, now approaching truly lethal scale, with ourselves not far in the distance. The human capacity to destroy one another on a massive scale has not been in doubt for a long time, with a hideous peak in the past century. What's happening now brings to mind a phrase made famous by Thomas Hobbes, man is a wolf to his fellow man. And it also brings to mind the bitter rejoinder by Joseph de Maistre that the comment is unfair to wolves who only kill for survival, unlike us. In thinking about the risks to survival, it's important to focus attention on the United States, particularly so for us, for American citizens. One reason is elementary moral principle. It's what we hope to shape and influence that must be of primary concern, which means those policies that are within reach, within our reach, typically policies of our own institutions, state and private. So we can deplore the building of coal plants in India, but we can't do much about it, directly at least. But we can do a lot about building coal plants in the United States. And in fact, a very clear choice about that extremely significant matter is arising in a few weeks when we have to choose between a presidential candidate who's committed to phasing out this highly destructive practice and another candidate who calls for accelerating the race to destruction. And there are other reasons for focusing on the United States, the reasons that hold for everyone in the world. Very simply, U.S. power in the global system is enormous without any historical comparison. That was clearly true in 1945, the date of the inception of these dual threats to survival. At that time, the U.S. had about 50% of total world wealth. Other industrial societies had been devastated by the war. The U.S. economy gained enormously from the war, virtually quadrupling industrial production, setting the stage for rapid post-war growth. The U.S. had been by far the richest country in the world for a century, but prior to World War II, it was not the major player in world affairs. And that was a role held primarily by England, secondarily France. But of course, all of that changed radically during the Second World War. France declined sharply as a world power, and the British ruefully recognized that they could only hope to be a junior partner in the system of world order managed in Washington, quoting the British Foreign Office. British officials had ample historical experience of their own, and accordingly they had few illusions about what was happening. And their descriptions are telling. They recognized in their words, I'm now quoting high British officials, that the economic imperialism of American business interests is attempting to elbow us out under the cloak of a benevolent and avuncular internationalism. Americans believe that the United States stands for something in the world, something of which the world has need, something which the world is going to like, something in the final analysis which the world is going to take, whether it likes it or not. He was articulating the real world version of what scholarship calls Wilsonian idealism, the version that conforms to the historical and internal record. Well, naturally, this position of global dominance, post-war position, couldn't be maintained entirely. Other industrial countries reconstructed, decolonization proceeded on its often agonizing course, leading to a more diverse international system, but which the United States still uniquely powerful. So by 1970, U.S. share of global wealth had declined to about 25%, still colossal, but not 50%, and it remains roughly there. These observations are fairly familiar, but they're also somewhat misleading. And the reason is because of the way that the globalization of the world economy has proceeded in the recent decades. Particularly revealing in this connection is quite important work by Sean Starrs. He's the first political economist to have closely investigated a very important topic, corporate ownership of the world's wealth. And it's becoming a more realistic measure of global power than national wealth in the neoliberal globalized world of the last few decades. It's no longer a world of nationally discrete political economies. And the results of investigations are quite dramatic. So it turns out that in virtually every sector, U.S. corporations are well in the lead in ownership of the international economy. And overall, their ownership is not far below 50%, about what U.S. national wealth was in 95. So one good illustration that he gives is iPhones. Everyone has one. These are assembled in China by two Taiwanese firms, the major one known as Foxconn. These two firms are in turn subcontractors for Apple. Foxconn's profit in 2014 was $4.3 billion, while Apple's was 10 times larger, $44.5 billion. And China's share of the profit was tiny, even though it's the exporter of iPhones. It adds very little value to the product. And there are similar measures across the international economy. Multinational corporations are nationally based. They rely on the nation state, ultimately the citizens of the nation state, for protection and sustenance, in fact, for their existence. And in the current globalized world of U.S. dominance of the global economy is, in important respects, not very different from what it was at the peak, the historical peak of 1945. In the military dimension, of course, the United States is entirely without parallel, spends almost as much as the rest of the world combined. It's technologically far more advanced, military bases all over the world, the military operations of one sort or another in a great many countries. No one else is even playing that game. It's unique. For reasons such as these, the importance of focus on U.S. policies should be quite clear. The military dimension leads us to the growing threat of nuclear war. It's primarily at the Russian border. There's a secondary threat off the coasts of China. It's concerning control of the South China Sea and contested islands. And it's important to bear in mind that the threats are not at the Mexican border or off the coasts of California and Florida. That's, again, a reflection of global power. At the Russian border, the most dangerous situation, both NATO and Russia are sharply increasing their military forces and also carrying out highly adventurous confrontational tactics, which are extremely hazardous. So there are close encounters of military jet planes, sometimes feet apart. NATO military exercises are taking place within a couple hundred yards of the Russian border. And there are many other highly provocative acts which can blow up by accident. Meanwhile, both sides are expanding their military arsenals. On the U.S. side, one significant element is Obama's plan for $1 trillion upgrading of the nuclear weapon system. That includes new nuclear weapons that are recognized by strategic analysts to be particularly dangerous. The reason is that they can be scaled down to tactical battlefield use. That offers temptations at times of conflict that could quickly escalate to full-scale nuclear war, terminal disaster. Also highly provocative is the $800 million missile defense system that Washington recently installed in Romania, allegedly in defense against non-existent Iranian nuclear missiles. It's recognized on all sides that what's called missile defense, insofar as it works at all, is actually an offensive weapon. It's part of an offensive military system. It could never stop a serious first strike, but it's conceivable that it might impede a retaliatory strike, which makes it a first strike weapon, of course. Hence, the Romanian installation is highly threatening to Russia. The threat of war at the Russian border is in significant part an outgrowth of NATO expansion since the collapse of the Soviet Union 25 years ago. That's during the administration of the first President Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, and in Russia, Mikhail Gorbachev. And what happened at that time is highly instructive, if you look at it closely. Gorbachev and Bush-Baker had conflicting visions of the world order that should arise with the disappearance of the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev called for dismantling of all military alliances to be replaced by a new unified Eurasian security system, which would integrate the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and Western Europe. Bush and Baker had a different plan, and NATO would expand while the Soviet system collapsed. The issue was joined right away over the most crucial question, the fate of Germany. Gorbachev agreed to German unification, even German accession to NATO, which is a pretty remarkable concession in the light of recent history. But there was a quid pro quo. NATO would not extend 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used in the negotiations, meaning East Germany. Expansion beyond that was not contemplated. Bush and Baker agreed to this compromise, but only verbally. It was a gentleman's agreement, a handshake, not in writing. NATO at once expanded to East Germany, but as Bush and Baker correctly stated, they were not violating a written pledge, just a gentleman's agreement. There's a rich scholarly literature trying to determine just what happened in those days. And there's a very recent publication which provides quite a surprising and instructive resolution to many of these questions. It's an article by Joshua Itzkowitz-Shifrinson in the prestigious journal International Security a couple of months ago. He carried out an extensive study of previously ignored archives, and it reveals quite persuasively that the Bush-Baker verbal commitments to Gorbachev were explicitly designed to mislead Gorbachev, while U.S. dominance extended to the east. That's quite an important discovery. That was only the first step. Under Clinton, NATO expanded further to the east. In 2008, and again in 2013, this is under Obama, NATO went so far as to offer membership in NATO to Ukraine. That's the Russian geopolitical heartland, long historical, cultural relationships with Russia, a highly provocative move which had many consequences. George Kennan, other senior statesmen, had warned early on that NATO enlargement would be, as they put it, a tragic mistake, a policy error of historic proportions. It's now leading to rising tensions on the Russian border, which is the traditional invasion route through which Russia was virtually destroyed twice in the past century by Germany alone, not just Germany as part of a huge military alliance led by the most powerful state in world history. The risk of terminal nuclear war is not slight. Reflecting on these matters, the European historian Richard Sakwa writes accurately enough that NATO's mission today is to manage the risks created by its existence. That's worth thinking about. Meanwhile, NATO's official mission has been extended well beyond the official mission to control the global energy system, pipelines and sea lanes, and unofficially to serve as an intervention force under U.S. command, as we've seen. long forgotten and apparently intended only to mislead are the promises made by George Bush and James Baker to Gorbachev that NATO would become a more political alliance in return for Gorbachev's agreement to allow German unification within NATO, which again was a remarkable concession in the light of history. Well, the fate of NATO since the end of the Cold War is quite revealing, shines a bright light on the real nature of the Cold War and its doctrinal basis. So NATO, of course, had been presented all along as necessary to hold off the Russian hordes. 1991, no more Russian hordes. So what happened? Did NATO disappear? No. It expanded in the manner that I described. That provides no slight insight into operative policies in the years before. What it reveals, which is pretty clear, had in fact not passed entirely unnoticed in mainstream scholarship. So a decade earlier, in 1981, Harvard professor, government advisor Samuel Huntington had observed that, in his words, you may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union you're fighting. That's what the United States has done ever since the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which is a pretty accurate description of what actually happened during the Cold War. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, pursuing the same logic, Huntington warned, his words, that Gorbachev's public relations can be as much a threat to American interests in Europe as were Brezhnev's tanks. And the threat of Gorbachev's peace offers was overcome in the manner just reviewed, and we're now facing the consequences. The mounting threat of war, particularly on the Russian border, has elicited considerable alarm in national security circles. Not discussed much, but in those circles they're watching. One highly respected analyst who's had long experience at the nuclear brink, as he describes it, warns that, his words, we are facing nuclear dangers today that are in fact more likely to erupt into a nuclear conflict than during the Cold War. That's former Defense Secretary William Perry recently. And he's far from alone. Every year, a group of experts organized by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists to update the Doomsday Clock that they established in 1947 at the dawn of the nuclear age. Midnight means terminal disaster. And the question is, how close is the hand to midnight? 2 years ago, they moved the clock 2 minutes closer to midnight to 3 minutes to midnight, where it remains. Now, that's the closest it's been to midnight since the Able Archer war scare of the early 1980s, which was quite severe, we now know. And explaining that decision, they invoked the growing threat of nuclear war, thinking particularly of the Russian border. But they also added something additional for the first time: the failure of governments to seriously deal with the impending environmental crisis, and in both cases with good reason. Well, there have been some steps to addressing the environmental crisis. The Paris agreements of last December have finally gone into effect officially. The provisions are inadequate, but they're at least something and a basis for going on. It had been hoped that the negotiations would lead to a verifiable treaty, but that goal was not attained. It's only a voluntary agreement, much weaker, of course. The reason for this was clearly understood. It was actually reported in the press, though not prominently enough. The reason was very simple. The Republican Congress would not accept binding commitments. So there is no verifiable treaty, only something much weaker, a matter of no slight importance and virtually no comment. It's actually an astonishing fact, if you think about it, that a major political organization in the most powerful country in world history is literally dedicated to destruction of much of life on Earth. Now that might seem to be an unfair comment, but I don't think it is. Right now, we're in the midst of the quadrennial electoral frenzy. Think about the Republican primaries, which recently ended. In the Republican primaries, every single candidate denied the facts about climate change. There was one exception, the guy who was supposed to be the sensible moderate, John Kasich. He conceded the facts, but said we should do nothing about it, which is even worse than denying them. That's 100%. The winning candidate calls for more use of fossil fuels, including coal plants, the most destructive. He also calls for dismantling regulations, refusing funds to developing societies that are seeking to move to sustainable energy, and in every possible way accelerating the race to disaster. When you consider the stakes, it's a fair question whether there has ever been a more dangerous organization in history than today's Republican Party. I think the answer is no. And worse still, there is no commentary on this. Right through the primary campaign, very little since. That astonishing blindness as the lemmings march to the precipice, in fact, extends well beyond. So in the past few years, there's been extensive and typically euphoric coverage of the prospects for 100 years of energy independence, given new technology for exploiting fossil fuels. Occasionally there's comment on the local impact of fracking, but scarcely a comment, if you can even find one in fact, and pointing out that the euphoria amounts to an enthusiastic call for the sixth extinction to swallow us up at will. Similarly, the growing threat of nuclear disaster barely elicits a mention. The two most important questions in human history on which the fate of the species depends are virtually missing from the extensive commentary on choice of leader for the most powerful country in world history. And we'll see how the matter is treated in the spectacle that many of us will endure in a few moments. I think you can predict. It's hard to find words to capture the enormity of this extraordinary blindness. In the case of nuclear weapons, we know how to overcome the threat, abolish them. And that's not a utopian dream. It's not advocated just by the War Resisters League, and I would guess many of us here. But it's also advocated by mainstream establishment figures. For example, Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, former Senator Sam Nunn, the Senate's leading specialist on nuclear weapons for many years, Henry Kissinger and William Perry. They are, in fact, the four signers of an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling for elimination, total elimination of this scourge. Another highly respected nuclear security expert, Bruce Blair, has recently formed a new organization called Global Zero, which calls for an international treaty to ban nuclear weapons. The International Court of Justice, in its historic advisory opinion in 1996 on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, it came quite close to this stand. And sensible, concrete steps have been proposed to this end, which could be taken right away. And surely steps can be taken to reduce the international tensions that are provoking the threat instead of escalating them. That the threat of global warming can be overcome effectively is less clear, though there are very clear steps that can and must be taken if there's to be any hope for decent human survival. And once again, decisions about these matters, the most important decisions in human history, and actions to implement these decisions cannot be delayed. Thanks.
Okay, so before kickoff, I think we've got time for some questions. So the first question, Noam, do you believe Edward Snowden deserves a pardon? Why or why not?
Yeah, I'm one of the signers of a petition, I think it was initiated by Amnesty International, calling for him to be pardoned. I don't think that goes far enough. He should not just be pardoned, he should be honored. And maybe Washington should be pardoned. That's up to you. But the question shouldn't arise in the case of Snowden, who simply performed the actions of a citizen who's concerned about his country and the world. He informed people, the citizens of the United States, of what their government is doing to them. Just what a citizen ought to do. So he should be honored, and we should be asking whether the government should be pardoned.
Okay. So next question, how should developed countries respond to the mass migrations caused by war and climate change?
Well, certainly not the way they're doing it. In fact, what's called the refugee crisis is in fact a moral crisis in the West. I mean, there are countries where there are cases in history of migrant crises that are severe. In fact, we're living in such a case. The migrant crisis from Europe eliminated or destroyed the indigenous population. That's a pretty serious crisis. That's the extreme case of migrant crisis. Today, there are countries that are absorbing huge numbers of refugees. Lebanon, poor country, has about 40% migrants, refugees. Lebanon had nothing to do with engendering the crisis, but it's taking the consequences. Jordan has a huge number of refugees, so does Turkey. The United States has practically none. Europe has very limited number, very small compared with its, not only with its wealth, but also with its role in creating the crises. Our role in recent years is even greater. So on the one hand, you have rich, powerful countries which have played a major role in creating the crises and are now groaning because maybe they'll have to accept a tiny bit of the consequences. And you have poor countries which had nothing to do with the crisis, which are absorbing the refugees. So that's a moral crisis. We have in the United States the same crisis with regard to Central America. People fleeing from Central America are, for the most part, fleeing from crimes that we committed. And then we tell Mexico to send them back and not let them come near our border, pretty much as Europe does in the case of Turkey. This is not only true of the migrants from Iraq, Syria, the Levant region, but also from Africa. One effect of the destruction of Libya, actually initiated by France and England, with the U.S. Leading from behind, as Obama put it, has been not only to destroy Libya, but to and vastly increase the level of the human disaster, catastrophe killings in Libya, but it also opened a funnel for people fleeing from Africa. Well, Europe has a certain relation to Africa over the past couple of centuries. Don't have to review it. Now Europe, again, groaning under the impact of the flight of people from regions it has devastated. And this is not ancient history, it's recent, current history. So take the richest country in Africa, potentially the richest country, which could have led Africa to become the flourishing region, Congo, enormous wealth. It was a Belgian colony. The treatment of the Congo by the Belgians was horrendous, even by the standards of European imperialism, which was horrible enough. It was one of the worst cases. In 1960, the Congo did achieve liberation. They had a political leader, young political leader, very promising, very popular, Patrice Lumumba. What happened? The CIA instantly targeted him for assassination, but they didn't make it. The Belgians managed to assassinate him first through proxies, and they didn't take any chances. So his body was cut up in pieces and dissolved in sulfuric acid. That took care of Lumumba, and the Congo hoped for independence. Then the United States and its allies supported a murderous kleptomaniac, Mobutu, as long as they could. Won't go through what's left of the country. Right now, the last couple of years, the worst atrocities in the world are carried out in the Congo. In eastern Congo, millions of people have been slaughtered in the last couple of years. One reason for it is your cell phones. Multinationals are hovering over the warring militias to get the minerals that are needed for high-tech equipment like cell phones in the West. That's the Congo. It's not ancient history. That extends over much of the region. So yes, there's a migrant crisis in Europe, a moral crisis, and one of extreme danger to the world. I mean, I'm old enough to remember what it means when Austria and Germany have political parties that are effectively neo-Nazi. I can remember Hitler's speeches in 1936, 37, and it's not a nice memory. And that's what's happening in reaction to what's called the refugee crisis. We have our own variant of it, which is severe and vicious. And again, of course, coming up in the presidential campaign.
Okay, so Noam, we also have a question now about Brazil. I would like you to comment about the coup in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's happened in Brazil is sometimes described as a coup. It's usually a soft coup. It's not a military coup of the kind that the U.S. helped initiate and back in 1964. The basis for it was was initiated by the Kennedy administration. It was carried out shortly after the assassination, instituted the first neo-Nazi style national security state in the hemisphere. It was later a plague that later spread through most of the hemisphere, reaching Central America in the 1980s. That was the 1964 coup. This one is not a military coup like that. it's a kind of a quasi-parliamentary coup. It removed from office practically the one political figure who has not been implicated in the corruption scandal in an effort to enrich herself. She's about the only one free from those charges. The people who are voting to impeach her, succeeded in voting to impeach her, almost all of them are under severe and significant charges of major corruption for their own benefit. So it's a soft coup. In fact, the Supreme Court of Brazil itself determined that the official charges against Dilma Rousseff are not legitimate charges, but that the impeachment went through nevertheless. The current government, the Temer government, is, actually I should say much of my information about this comes from my wife, Valeria, who's Brazilian, tells me what's happening in the Brazilian newspapers. The current government is instituting extremely reactionary policies, clearly attempting to dismantle the progress and achievements that were made by under the PT, the Workers' Party, in the past 15 years. Now, they're guilty of plenty of crimes. They did some pretty awful things. But they did also carry out policies which were quite beneficial to much of the population, now being reversed. The new coup government, if you want to call it that, is all white, all male, in a diverse country. And the policies are pretty frightening, of course, strongly supported by the United States. As part of an effort on the part of the United States to reverse the progressive developments that have taken place in Latin America in the past 15 years. And I should say the left elements in these countries have plenty to answer for. They did a lot of things which are quite blameworthy, totally wrong, but nothing justifies the soft coup that's taking place.
Okay, Noam, we have a question about education, higher education, and popular education. What do you recommend for people who want to study at university level, but cannot afford it and do not want to get tangled up in loans and debt?
Well, what they ought to do, I mean, you can't answer the question for an individual, but we should be answering it collectively. So we should be asking, for example, why are there costs for higher education? Why isn't it like secondary education? And again, that's not a strange question. There's certainly no economic basis for it. If you look around the world today, the richest, most successful countries have free, virtually free higher education. So Germany, which is the most successful of the modern state capitalist societies, higher education is virtually free. Finland, which comes out at the top in almost all international competitions, free, so on across the board. If you go to poor countries, just go south of the border to Mexico, poor country, quite a respectable higher education system. I've been there and taught. It's quite respectable, high quality. It has problems like very low salaries, so the faculty have to have second jobs, but that's because it's a very poor country. Education's free. Take a look at our own country. In the 1940s and 1950s, 50s and 60s, the great growth period, highest growth period in American society, higher education was virtually free. For a huge number of people, it was not only free but subsidized, namely those beneficiaries of the GI Bill. People who never would have gone to college were enabled to do so, very good for themselves, very good for the country, contributed to successful economic growth. Even private colleges, like Ivy League colleges, though they had tuition, it was extremely low. I entered the University of Pennsylvania in Ivy League College in 1945. Tuition was $100. That would be maybe $800 by today's real value, and you could easily get a scholarship. So it was essentially free. It was a much poorer country then. The U.S. today is far richer than it was in that period. I think if you think it through, there can't really be an economic reason for this. There are other reasons, not good reasons. You can think what they might be. But I think in answer to the question, an individual is stuck. That person is stuck with what exists. But as part of a collective, that person is not stuck. They can be part of an effort to reverse the programs of the past, the policies of the past 30 years, roughly 30, 40 years, which have led to the situation in which young people are trapped for life with debt that they cannot get rid of. Notice that I'm sure you know this, the policies are set up so that you can't declare bankruptcy like a business. The government can garnish your Social Security. You're trapped for life. A highly disciplinary measure, incidentally. And I don't think there's any justification for it. Like other things, individually you can't do much about it. Collectively you could do quite a lot.
So Noam, now there's a question about your view on artificial intelligence and the threat or hope that it presents.
Well, when anyone asks that question, the first thing that comes to mind is a famous comment that was made by a great biologist at MIT, Jerry Letvin, in a debate about artificial intelligence back around 1960. And at the end of the debate, he conceded that artificial intelligence was pretty interesting, but he said it was misnamed. It should have been called natural stupidity. But it's a bit unfair, but not totally. There's a lot of hype about artificial intelligence, and there are some achievements, like, say, a Google Translator achievement. Robotics can make some achievements, but it's doing very little from a scientific point of view. It's achieving things from a kind of an engineering point of view, which is okay. Nobody should be opposed to bigger bulldozers if they work. But we shouldn't be misled about the insight that it's supposed to be providing into the nature of intelligence. It's not doing that. It's often some other direction. So it's a valuable pursuit, which can be useful. If it does, insofar as it is part of science, which it is partially, it's just ordinary cognitive science, an effort to try to find the nature of intelligent behavior using computer-based models as a technique of research. It's fine. Actually, it's pretty close to the kind of work I've done all my life myself. But you should be pretty cautious about evaluating the PR that's associated with it, which pretty often is quite remote from the actual level of insight obtained by these measures. Now, there are also threats of artificial intelligence, serious ones. That's particularly true in the weapon system. If the weapon system becomes automated, we're in deep trouble. Automated systems fail all the time. Any of you who have computers are familiar with this. They cannot be made reliable. And if they're unless there are very narrow controls, tight controls, they can blow up. Actually, I gave a couple of cases when I was talking, past cases. We know the U.S. record is fairly open. The Russian record is probably much worse. We don't know. But in the case of the United States, there have been literally hundreds of cases when there were the automated detection systems that detect an alleged missile attack just gave the wrong answer, misfired. And often we were within minutes of responding. Human intervention interceded. And that's going to be true pretty generally. That's a serious problem. So using AI in the weapon system is something extremely dangerous, as is the weapon system itself. In other areas, the techniques can often be useful. The fear, the idea that, say, robotics are going to displace working people, and people will be out of jobs with all these smart machines around, there's just no evidence for that at all. I mean, if you look around the country, there's a huge amount of work to be done. Take a walk in any city, they're all falling apart. Plenty of things to be done. Education, way underfunded. Research, do vastly more. There's vast needs all over the place. There are plenty of idle hands. There are resources to use those idle hands to do the necessary work, but the system is so corrupt that it can't put them together. That's the problem, not the fear that robots are going to displace us. In fact, to the extent that dull, boring work can be taken over by automata, that's liberating. It frees people to do more interesting things, including having leisure. The United States has much less leisure than comparable countries, and nothing wrong with using leisure to enrich your own lives in whatever way you choose, and there's certainly nothing wrong with freeing people to do more creative, independent work and let the robots do the boring and dangerous stuff.
Okay.
Are we running into this?
Let's
Okay.
take two more. What do you think?
It's okay with me.
All right, we're going to 2 more questions.
Is there ever a role for a benevolent imperialism? It's kind of like asking whether there's a role for a benevolent slave owner. Probably. I mean, it's better to have a benevolent slave owner than a slave owner who's a murderous, brutal, vicious thug. But the concept is an oxymoron. It just can't happen. What gives you hope? People like you. That's the hope of the future. The future's in your hands. There's a lot that can be done, despite all the problems of the country. It's actually a much more civilized country than it was 50 years ago. Much more, in all kinds of ways. The rights of women, for example, all sorts of other things. That didn't come as a gift. Came out of popular struggle, often pretty hard. But it left a legacy to us. We benefit from it. It kind of gives us a plateau from which to go on. Plenty of problems. In fact, the worst problems in human history, but they can be addressed. And people like you are in a position to address them. And that's where the hope is.